I hope you all are having a wonderful week. My name is Yupari, and I'd like to invite you into this week's portrait painting demonstration. And in this week's video, I'm going to dedicate this one to those of you that want to push your paintings to the next level. So let's get into the academic approach. The academic approach to portrait painting is a systematic approach that's been developed by many years throughout many schools, and it is one unified way of working that simplifies the three most important aspects involved in creating a portrait painting, and that is shape, value, and color. So the question of shape will be answered with an underdrawing. Now the question of value will be answered with an underpainting. And then finally, the question of color will be answered with finishing off the painting with color. So I think that this is a very useful way of painting, albeit it's very time consuming. I understand that, but it's extremely effective in terms of creating beautiful results. And I really want you to have this method. So let's get to the video. Here's an image of our model Romy, and I'm going to keep a picture of her to the top left corner of your screen so you can refer to it as the painting develops. So we're going to start this painting off with a preliminary sketch. So we're going to start off with a charcoal drawing. So I'm going to be working on pastel paper using medium vine charcoal. And if you want to know exactly which materials I'm using as far as the paints and the drawing material, all of that is going to be typed in this description box below. So feel free to look in the description box and all of that information will be typed up for you. So now then, I'm going to start off with a simple linear drawing, and I'm going to try and get this linear drawing as accurate as I can possibly get it. So with the academic method, you really want to have a very strong linear foundation. Linear meaning that it is constructed just with simple shapes, simple straight lines and angles. So right now I just have the basic shape for the outside of the head. Now I'm going to take a little bit longer with the construction of the outside shape before I get into the inside shape. So I'm going to work the exterior shapes for a while and then let that build into the interior shapes. And I'm going to be just using my eye. I'm not going to be doing any kind of measuring. I'm not going to be breaking out a ruler or anything like that. If you want to get a ruler and measure where everything goes, that is perfectly fine. But I'm just trying to use straight lines and angles, and again, using medium vine charcoal, just establishing where these large shapes are going to fit. And you may also notice that there is some charcoal lines surrounding the portrait, and I just basically outlined the canvas that I'm going to be painting on top of. So once this linear drawing is complete, then I will be transferring the drawing onto the canvas. So that's why I drew that rectangular looking shape. Now I'm just trying to get a simple idea for the outside shape. We have a little angle here for the top of the forehead. Now here's a little bit of the side of the hair, and then I'm going to follow through on the other side. Here we have another simple straight line, another straight line right there, and we're going to look at the hair mass as just a simple geometric shape. We're going to be thinking primarily two-dimensional with the linear block in. So this block in is being done so that once we get to the painting stage, all of those questions in terms of where things are going to fit, the height to width ratio, all of that is going to be figured out. We're going to want to have all of that figured out beforehand. So this process is really about knowing how to manage your time, as opposed to trying to create the painting all in one sitting, which is what I usually do. But I think that this process is something that everyone should try at least once. It is a very time-consuming process trying to get each and every little shape and nuance onto this piece of pastel paper, and then after all that's said and done, transferring it, and then we're going to underpaint it after that, and then finally get to the color painting. But one thing I don't usually talk about in my painting videos is how to manage your time. So notice here I just moved the corner of the side of the jaw a little bit to the left of the screen here. So taking your time with each stage can help you stay fresh or keep a fresh eye when it comes to making decisions. So let's consider the painting. Let's think about the painting process as a visual puzzle. So instead of thinking about trying to copy what the model looks like in front of me, instead I'm thinking about this whole process as just one simple visual puzzle. And the objective at this current stage of the puzzle is to identify and to locate the simple linear construct. Notice I keep pushing and pulling shapes around. Now I'm starting to add another shape. So now let's get into the center line. So this center line is going to divide the face in half, and it's going to give me the turn that the model is making in relation to me. So that center line I just drew in there is telling me that the model is at a 3/4 view in relation to me, but 3/4 a little bit closer to profile. So now we have just a little mass here for the eyes, for where the eyes are going to go. And now we're going to place in a simple mark here for the nose. Now I'm going to be moving the charcoal around kind of freely in the beginning. Notice I'm holding the vine charcoal from the furthest distance back, very similar to how I would be doing this with a brush. So now that was the first accent mark for the eye socket. So very simply, we have a mark for the eye socket. Now we have a little bit of an edge right there. So that's going to tell me where the corner of the eye socket is going to go. And just trying to get an idea of these angles here. So I'm just trying to get an idea with the most minimal lines I can possibly use. So now I'm going to get a brush here and use a horizontal line. So this horizontal line is telling me the angle between the two eyebrows. All I want right now is the angle between the two eyebrows. And the angle is very, very, very slight, but I want to get it as accurate as I possibly can. Now let's look at this line right here. So this is going to be the zygomatic bone, and oftentimes I like to put a little accent there for the zygomatic. So the zygomatic is the cheekbone. So I like to think about the drawing structurally, even though I said we're trying to keep this two-dimensional. I do think about the location of the plane of the side of the cheekbone, and here we're following through on the other side of the cheekbone. And another thing I should mention is that I'm erasing with a chamois cloth. So that is a chamois cloth. So I'm just using the chamois cloth and the medium vine charcoal. So now we have another accent for the nose, and just a simple little mark here will kind of give me an idea of where the bottom of the nose is going to go. So now with the mouth, we're going to do the same kind of thing. So we have just an accent for the corner of the mouth. Now we're going to think about the entire structure of the orbicularis oris. Again, I know I'm trying to keep this two-dimensional, but I can't help thinking about this structure. So I'm thinking a little bit about the structure of the mouth as I place down these accent marks. So what you're seeing are just accent marks to help me place where the features are going to go. Again, I'm going to be using a horizontal line to get the angle, and that angle is going to be the angle between the two eyes. So just one mark here for one eye, and then I'm going to follow through the axis to the other side. Now, there is a little bit of an irregularity with the angle of the eyes. So the eye to the right of the screen is angled a little bit higher up than the eye to the left. Very slightly, but they are angled. So that is a little bit of an irregular angle. That is irregular being that it's not horizontal. Now then, the purpose here, I reiterate, is to know what we're looking for. And that is, we're just gathering information about where the features are going to fit onto this large simplified structure of the face. And that's it. We're just gathering that simple bit of information. So here we have the top of the upper lip. So with the lips, I tend to work from the top of the upper lip and then the corners of each side of the lips, being the left corner and the rightmost corner and the bottom of the lip, to place them. And again, it's really about having a place marker. So we're thinking about each feature as a place marker right now. So using just simple straight lines and angles and constructing a lip in, say, less than a minute, like you just saw me do, is going to be very useful, because we're going to get all of our puzzle pieces onto the table here, so to speak. So we're going to get all of our information and try and get it as accurate as possible, knowing that it's not going to be quite right just yet. So once we get these simple shapes, that is the place markers for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, then we will be able to relate these shapes to one another. And you really want to spend as much time as you are willing to spend trying to get these simple shapes. So here we have the bottom of the chin. And so now I'm going to look at the angle right here between the bottom of the chin. And I think that I'm seeing a little bit of the bottom of this area of the chin. And so in terms of the perspective, that is the relative position that I am in relation to the model, I'm looking slightly up at the model. So that is, I'm a little bit lower. I'm certainly not looking from above. I'm not looking from over top of the model. I'm very much looking very below. I'm pretty much, I'd say, at the shoulder level. So that's why I'm seeing a little bit of the bottom plane of the chin. And I'm also seeing a little bit of the bottom of the nose. Now then, we have a very simple angle here for the side of the jawbone. And I'm trying to look at the corner of the eye now. So that little line right there is going to give me an idea of the furthest distance to the right of the eye. And I follow through with the other eye. So I want to know the furthest distance to the left and the furthest distance to the right. And now I'm going to look at the top of the curve. So the topmost area is probably about here. So that is the area right above the eyebrow. So now I'm going to place a more simple shape for the eyes. So notice how it starts very simply with just maybe 4 or 5 straight lines and angles. So now I'm going to erase that little shape there on the bottom. Now I'm going to follow through with the other side. So try to work both sides of the drawing. Try to work both sides simultaneously. One mark on the left and then another mark on the right. And this little eraser right here is my kneaded eraser. So a kneaded eraser kind of looks like Play-Doh a little bit, but it's very good at erasing fine charcoal and even graphite. So now we have a very simplified shape for the eye. So now we have a little line for the top of the eyelid. And now I'm going to stand back and assess the drawing. Always make sure that you stand back It's important to stand back as often as you can to get an idea of what the drawing looks like at a distance. But I will say, with a linear drawing, it's a lot more difficult to gauge your proportions than if you were working with color. But the advantage of having this linear drawing is that you kind of have a second chance, really. So you're going to be constructing a linear drawing, and then you transfer the drawing. So when we transfer it, we're going to have a second chance, because any mistakes that we have with this drawing, I think I have the drawing perhaps a little bit too wide at this point. Any of those mistakes we can correct once we transfer it onto the canvas. So the advantage of doing a transfer drawing is that it really gives you a second chance. So that is, you try to work out the shapes as accurately as possible with the linear construct, with this simple drawing. And then when you transfer it onto the canvas, it's like you're getting a fresh look at the picture that you are creating. Looking at the image on another surface really kind of gives you an advantage, as opposed to just trying to complete the painting from start to finish on the same canvas for the entire time. So now I just blocked in a few little dark shapes onto the nose, the eyes, and the mouth. So I'm trying to block in just light and dark shapes, and it can be kind of difficult to gauge your drawing, or try to gauge the accuracy of your drawing just using line alone. So that's why I'm starting to put in some dark shapes for the eyes, the nose, and for the mouth. We're going to block in some dark shapes for the cast shadow onto the neck, and for the dark mass of the hair. So now, having this two-tone depiction of the image you're looking at is going to be extremely helpful in terms of gauging your proportions. And a lot of artists, a lot of visual artists have many different ways of looking at the subject, but I kind of think about this as an overexposed photograph. So now, with a little watercolor brush, I'm kind of blending the charcoal into the paper. Notice how I'm kind of blending it in, and that's just kind of to make it a little bit more smooth. You could use a stump if you'd like to, but imagine this as an overexposed photograph, where you're only seeing the darkest darks, and the lights are all pretty much just washed out. So we can make a kind of a reference to photography. So I did a vertical gesture there to gauge where the bottom corner of the mouth is going to fit. So I think it fits about there. So I'm going to use the watercolor brush to kind of smudge at it a little bit, just to lower that shape down just a tiny bit more. And I'm going to follow through onto the other side. And again, just working with, primarily just working with two values, just light and dark. I am, however, making some accent marks for the corners of the features. Notice the corner of the mouth to the left, and the corner of the mouth to the right, and for the bottom of the mouth. So here we're going to make another vertical gesture just to make sure that the pieces are fitting where they should. So now we're going to start to put in a little dark accent here for the nostril. So it starts off with just a simple little shape like this. And here too, you can actually see the grain of the pastel paper. So this paper is pretty good at taking a beating. So I'm just going to dig the charcoal right into this area here. So here we have one nostril, and now I'm going to sharpen the charcoal a little bit by just shading into the hair. So I'm actually just trying to get a fine point onto the charcoal. So that's I guess that's sharp enough. So I'm going to put the dark accent for the other nostril. And since we're seeing the model at a 3/4 view, we're going to be seeing less of the right side. So the right side relative to your screen. I'm going to use the little watercolor brush. I'm going to take some of the charcoal off, and then push it onto the side of the eye socket here. Notice I'm putting in just a simple little value here with the watercolor brush. So the texture of the pastel paper actually allows me to place in some charcoal with some very soft edges using this little watercolor brush. And it's pretty much just to get the dark lights for the corners of the eye socket right about here. So that's going to be the area that's going to be pretty far away from the light. And so I wanted to make sure to get that value in there. So here we have a little bit of the dark of the iris. And so we have just a little shape for that. Now I'm going to go back to the watercolor brush and I'm going to smoothen this out just a little bit. And I'm going to take some more charcoal from the hair and push it right into this corner. So let's take a little more charcoal and push a little more into the texture or the grain of the paper. And so here we have a little shape for the top of the eyelid. And I'm going to make that a little bit more smooth. Now this is kind of unnecessary, but I just like to get some type of finite shape for the eye. And again, this is going to be really useful for the painting. All of these shapes are going to be transferred as accurately as we possibly can transfer them onto the canvas. So now let's peel out just a little highlight for the eye there, and another little highlight for the bottom of the eyelid. Just a few little touches there for the drawing. And let's do the same thing to the mouth. So we're going to put in just a little more of a dark mask for the upper lip. Just a little bit. And then we're going to kind of smoothen it out very simply. And again, this is pretty much just for the sake of the drawing. So for the transfer, we're only going to be taking the light and the dark shapes. But gathering this information on your drawing will actually help you, because you can have your drawing right next to you while you're working on the painting. And hey, if you figured it out with the drawing, all you have to do is transfer that information or that thinking onto the painting. And it really just, it makes your painting that much stronger. I'm gonna make it just a little softer on this corner here. And again, when we get to the painting, we're going to be taking some of those ideas or some of that information that we figured out on the drawing to make the painting that much stronger. So now let's peel out a little bit of light right here with the kneaded eraser, and a little bit of light right about here onto the bottom of the lip. So there's a little bit of a light right about here. We don't want to do too much on the lips, just a little bit of a highlight on that area. So that is it for the transfer drawing. Again, we don't want to render too much. We just want to have primarily the light and the dark shapes. I strongly recommend to do this for your paintings. Just a simple linear drawing can do a lot of good for your paintings in the long run. It really does save a lot of struggles when you get into form modeling. So now we're going to put a little piece of transfer paper, and with a little pencil here, so this is actually a pastel pencil, I'm going to be tracing now the outlines of the linear drawing. And if there are any mistakes in your linear drawing, now is the time to correct them with the transfer paper. Very simple straight lines and angles, and maybe a few little hatch marks here and there for some of the dark lights. Notice these little accents. Now we're going to flip the transfer paper over, and with medium vine charcoal, we're just going to drill it right onto the back side of the transfer paper in this kind of fashion. You could also just cover the entire backside if you want to, but doing this actually helps me see the lines on the other side of the paper with a little bit more clarity. So now we're going to stamp it onto our canvas, so it pretty much helps you to use a pen with a very bright color to trace right on top of the marks that you created. And now we're going to lift that off, and there you go. You have the transfer drawing that simple. So now with acrylic burnt umber and a very tiny round brush, we're going to once again draw out the linear construct. Now I'm using acrylic paint just because of time. If you would like to use oil paint for this, by all means use oil paint, but the purpose is just to trace right over your lines. Nothing more complicated than that. Just tracing right over them. And we're going to just put in a little thin wash still with the acrylic paint for the darks. Just light and dark. And let's call this the poster image. So the poster image is going to be just the light and dark shapes. Very simply in this kind of fashion. In a couple minutes, this acrylic wash is going to dry on us. And then we're going to now start to get into our underpainting. So we've switched to oil paints now, and I'm using water mixable oil paints. And so water mixable oil paints, of course, they thin out with water. So I'm not going to be using any mineral spirits here. And it's not really for health reasons. It's mainly because water mixable oil paints tend to dry a little bit faster than regular oil paints. And add to that a fast drying medium, and we're going to be having our layers dry after each sitting. So I actually will work on this painting for 3 or 4 consecutive days with the painting drying on me overnight, which is a very useful advantage to me. Now, the fast drying medium that I'm using is going to be typed in the description below, but it's sold specifically for the water mixable oil paints. And I'm not trying to market water mixable oil paints or anything like that. So if you want to use regular oil paints, that's perfectly fine. You could use something like Liquin or some type of alkyd to speed the drying times of your oil painting. So we're going to start off with the forehead. So we're going to start off with the halftone. So we're going to jump very quickly into the study of the forms. So we're going to look at the forms very carefully. Now, because we did that linear drawing and we transferred it and we very carefully and meticulously figured out the light and dark shapes, we're not going to worry about that at all for the rest of the painting. So for the rest of the painting, we're going to focus solely on form and color. Just form and color. That's all we're going to focus on. So right now we have just a dark shape for the glabella and dark values for the corners of the forehead. So we're starting from the darks and working our way up. And the consistency of the paint, it's fairly thin. So the paint is extremely thin, and I'm using a pretty generous amount of the fast drying medium. Now again, there is nothing special to the fast drying medium that I'm using or the oil paints that I'm using. I will admit though, I really like the water mixable oil paints more than I thought I would. They dry right after I'm done with the sitting. I mean, overnight this painting was dry, or it dried overnight, and the next day, pretty much 24 hours later, I was ready to add on another sitting. So we're building our way from the corners of the forehead to the highlight region of the head, and using less and less paint as we get towards the lighter area. Now, I'm working very thin. I want the paint consistency to be extremely thin for this layer, and each and every layer that we add onto it, each and every layer that we add onto the painting is going to increase the amount of actual paint that we use. And I'm using a size 1 round brush. And I'm going to be using round brushes for the majority of the shapes on the face. And the reason I'm going to be using round brushes is that I can get a very specific mark from round brushes that I cannot get with a filbert or with a flat brush. So now we're going to be adding a little bit of the white right here to the forehead. And so the key to this is compression, value compression. Now, value just means how light or how dark something is. And we're going to be focusing on the values for a very long time. Now, the advantage of this technique is that it isolates each facet of the painting. So there are 3 facets: shape, value, and color. And it's not a coincidence that there are 3 stages to this process: the linear drawing, the underpainting, and then the color painting. That is no coincidence. We figured out the shapes as accurately as we possibly could so that we can, with ease, come in form by form, as we're doing right now, and accurately and peacefully study the values. So now the corner of the eyes a little bit darker. You can see that I started with the dark, so that's kind of the way that I approach the forms. I start with the distances, or I start with the areas furthest away from the light and build my way up to the light. Notice this little dark accent right here is the corner of the side of the eye socket. You can see on the photo reference that that area is very, very dark. Now this corner here is also very, very dark. So I'm going to start to build my way as I go. Now, think about that brush as an inquisitive brush, a curious brush. It is a brush that is very much focused on structure. It's focused on value. It's focused on tone. That's the purpose of this pass. We're very much just trying to figure out the structures in a very thin passage of paint. Now with the fast drying medium, this will start to dry within a matter of hours. So I will come back in and further develop the tonal understructure of the painting with yet another pass of Zinc White and Burnt Umber. And I'll tell you why I'm using Burnt Umber. So Burnt Umber is a pretty good kind of in-between color that leans a little bit warmer. So it's a little bit warmer than it is cool. So it actually allows you to build flesh tones of any kind on top of it. So I find that it's a little bit easier to build on top of a warmer underpainting than it is to build on top of a cooler one, at least for me. And it's also a very classical way of working with a kind of a brown underpainting. So here we have a little bit darker now on the side of the eye socket. So I'm following through on the other side, and I'm very much just trying to imagine the volume of this structure. So here we have another plane here on the side. So each individual application of paint is in consideration of a plane. And the more planes that you put in, the more dimensional your painting will become. Now, a plane is just a concept of a flat surface in a 3-dimensional space. So now notice how we're going to start to add in lighter planes onto this little middle region of this eye socket and darker planes right here on the corner. And that is because just like we did with the drawing, the values are going to be getting darker as the structures or the planes angle further away from the light. Notice now I'm starting to modify that change in value because the planes on the side of the eye socket are facing the light less. So the light source, the direction of the light source is going to be really important to you in terms of figuring out where these planes are going to fit. So the light is very much overhead of the model, and you can also gauge the shadow of the nose. You can look at the shadow of the nose and kind of give you the general direction that the light source is coming from. So now we placed in some more darks into the eyes. So again, just looking at light and dark shapes. So here's the side of the eye, and then here's the other side of the eye that's receiving more light. And this is very relaxing, I will tell you. Have yourself a cup of tea, put on some classical music or however you'd like to relax, and just take it one step at a time. Believe me, this is a lot of fun. It's very different to how I usually work. I usually work in Alla Prima, where I build everything kind of directly onto the surface. But this way of working is a very tried and true way of developing a painting, and it's really useful in terms of time management. So now I'm going to go in with the dark shapes underneath of the nose. Now, what I mean by time management is that you're not really stressed out about trying to get the painting finished in one sitting. At least that's how I feel when I do Alla Prima or working directly wet on wet, as opposed to dividing my time into individual layers. So here we have a plane on the top of the nose that's facing the light a little bit further, and now we're working our way up to the bulb of the nose. And so there's a little bit of a dark light here on the bottom of the nose. So a dark light is the light just as you approach the shadow, and it's going to be the light that's going to help you create the illusion of form the fastest. Notice that the starting off with the dark lights or the darker halftones for the nose actually helps to develop the forms a little bit quicker. So now here we are on the side plane of the nose. So this little area here is kind of descriptive of the kind of a rectangular structure for the nose. We're very much looking at the two divisions of planes as very simple chops. And so now we're going to unify those chops. So we're thinking kind of like a sculpture. So we're treating this kind of like clay, where we're molding the shapes around. So with a little bit more of the fast drying medium, we have a little bit more thinned out consistency, which is what we want for the light shapes here. So we just scumbled that on just a little bit here. So now with a little bit of a lighter value, we're going to put in the little highlight. But that highlight is not meant to be the final say for the highlight. It's just to get an idea of the simple structure. So now we're working the side of the corner of the cheekbone. So there's a top plane right there, and now we're approaching the bottom. So it's a little bit darker right about here, so we're going to make it a little bit darker in value. And just a simple value change like that from one value to the next can really help to describe the form very accurately. So now we're going to be mixing up a little bit of a halftone here with a little bit more of the fast drying medium. And now we're going to work the other side of the face. So there's a little shape here for the bottom of the structure of the eye. So just a little shape right about there. And it's going to be lighter as we approach the bottom eyelid, right about here. And we really want to keep the paint very thin. Never emphasize that. I cannot emphasize that enough. Keep the paint very, very thin. So now we just drew out a little bit more of a specific shape for the plane of the cheekbone. So the zygomatic region. And so the nose rests on the maxilla. So the maxilla is another region of bony mass where the nose or the cartilage of the nose sits. And so that area is surrounded by the side planes of the cheeks. So the areas that we left white on purpose because we're going to come back in there with some lighter values. So now just adjusting the values a little bit. Now we're going to work a little bit lighter. So right about here, and maybe a little bit darker. So let's go back to more of a halftone. Notice how I'm just patting the paint onto the surface. I'm not really worried about the brush strokes at all. I'm just focused on the significance of the actual application of paint rather than the individual brush strokes. So now we're going to go in very rapidly, fill in a value for the top plane of the cheekbone. And it's a little bit darker right here as we approach the side plane of the nose, and now very quickly onto the other side of the face. Now this area here is a little bit lighter as we approach the corner of the nose. So now going in with a little bit of a halftone right here for the bottom of the side of the bottom of the zygomatic region. So now with a darker value, we're going to get kind of a dark light, and we're going to work the side of the side plane of the face. So this area is a very dark light that's turning very far away from the light. Now, I normally would say don't lose track of your light and shadow shapes, and that still holds true, but I did not block in the dark for the bottom of the cheekbone yet. I'm very much just focused on the values for the side plane of the face. So now this area here is a little bit darker, and so that's going to be describing to me the plane of the side of the cheekbone. So this whole value right here, this whole value is a zone, and it's a zone that is darker than, say, the forehead. So let's think about these values as zones or as neighborhoods. So a zone that is darker means that all of the values within that area must remain within that value relationship. So what am I talking about? So the light plane of the cheekbone is a zone that is in general lighter than the side plane of the cheekbone. Now this area here to the bottom of the chin, so this is going to create another zone. So this zone here is going to be a little bit darker than, say, the forehead. So what I mean is the average value of a darker zone is going to be in general darker than the average value of a lighter zone. And I hope that's not too confusing. All I'm saying is that the side planes are going to be darker than the top planes with the light coming from the top, as it is with this image. So notice how we're going to be getting lighter now as we move up with these planes. So each plane that we put in there has a consideration, a spatial consideration for the position of the light. So that area that we just filled in a very sloppy fashion was a lot lighter than, say, this area of the lips. So let's think about the lips as another zone, and the lips might be the best place to actually describe what a zone means. So the local value of the lips is in general darker than everywhere else. So that means that the average value within the lips is darker than the average values on pretty much anywhere you look on the light side of the face. So now we're going to start to block in just a little shape here for the bottom of the cheekbone, and for the bottom of the jawbone, and very much still keeping the consistency of the paint very, very thin. And we're using a lot of the fast drying medium for this area here. Now with water mixable oil paints, do not thin out your paints with the water. I'm going to repeat that. With water mixable oil paints, do not thin out the paint with water. And if you do, use very little, very tiny amounts of water. And that is because the water for water mixable oil paints is a very good cleaner, but it's so good that the paint falls off as soon as you use water. So be very careful with how much water you're using. So now with the side plane of the cheek, I just made it a little bit darker. So remember that zone means that the average value there is darker than the other areas. So now I pretty much am starting to make some of the areas darker. So this area right about here is going to be, in general, a little bit darker. So I'm making the plane of the glabella a little bit darker right about here. And I'm kind of fuzzing it into the forehead. I don't want too many sharp edges on the portrait, especially with the underpainting. I want to keep things rather soft. So now here we have a little bit more of a dark light for the side of the ear. And here we have the dark shape now outlined for the ear, just a little dark for the outside corner of the ear. So now we're going to come back in and add just a little bit of a darker value onto the cast shadow beneath the jawbone. And so now we're going to get into some more of the darker shapes. So we're going to switch to the size 4 Filbert brush. And so now we're going to just cover the surrounding shapes of the portrait fairly thin. Now remember I said do not thin out the water mixable with water. I pretty much just use tiny bits of the fast drying medium to thin out the paint. So now we're going to go back into the underpainting and we're going to further develop the forms. So notice how there are some darker lights in there now. So we're going to start to add more depth into the plane. So here's a little plane here emerging from the side of the concavity of the eye. And we're going to just emphasize this dark a little bit more here. Just kind of scrubbing this value onto the surface. I'm sorry that the canvas is a little bit bouncy, so there's going to be some bouncing here and there. So here we have a little bit of a darker shape surrounding the corner of the tear duct. And now we're going to make this little dark shape on the corner of the side of the eye a little bit darker, and then we're going to follow through with this plane here for the side of the eye. So I'm going to darken it a little bit and then gauge whether that value is working or not in relation to the surrounding values. It might be too dark for the moment, but hey, that's the reason we're doing an underpainting, to get acclimated with the structures and the forms through simple applications of value. So now let's push that shape a little bit higher up, and maybe this shape needs to go a little bit darker. Now this approach to painting is a very strategic approach. Every layer is very carefully planned out. So let's reiterate what we are doing with this underpainting. So we're picking form by form. So we're moving form by form and adding more depth into the structures via application of tone. And what is the cornerstone of everything is that linear construct. That linear drawing that we did in the beginning is the cornerstone. It is the foundation to which you can literally see everything else is being built on top of. Every individual plane that I'm adding onto these structures is resting on the underlying structure that we depicted with the linear construct. That linear construct is helping us to create all of this. And so we just put in a few little extra lights, and let's add just a little bit more light here. Even the upper eyelid is going to have some top planes and some side planes. So that was the top plane of the upper eyelid, and see how just with very simple applications of tone and considerations for the structure, we're having the form develop right in front of our eyes. It's a very wonderful thing to see these forms develop right in front of you in a very simple fashion. So now it's going to be a little bit darker here on this area. And so I'm going to be adding a little bit more paint, and in fact it's supposed to be lighter. So again, we're kind of feeling our way around the planes here, so that area will eventually be lighter. So here's a little dark light to the side of the bottom of the lower eyelid. So this area is going to be a little bit darker, so it's going to receive a darker halftone, but it's not quite that dark. Here's the side plane of the nose, and this area here is going to be yet even darker, just like we did with that first pass with the underpainting. Now we're going to be further emphasizing the depth of this form now. Now the reason I did that first wash, if you will, of an underpainting was so that I knew that with the water-soluble oil paints, it would settle in really quickly. So I did take a break between that sitting and this one. So several hours passed, and I came back and started to develop these forms with the same underpainting with the with these darker values. Pretty much, I'll tell you, it's probably about 4 hours or so, and that wash that we painted was already dry. Amazing stuff. The water mixable with the fast drying medium. Very amazing stuff. In any case, now we're going to be adding a little bit of light right about here. So that would be the nasal bone receiving very bright light because the plane is angled closer to the light. So another thing I should emphasize, and I'd hate to admit it, but I'm going to admit it, my linear drawing was not perfect. So some of the placements of the features may be a little bit off. Now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. So a lot of classical paintings, or a lot of how to put this, classical painting is not about copying a model. It's not about copying exactly what you're looking at. Very strange to think about, isn't it? Because those paintings are so realistic. In fact, what we're doing is we are conceptualizing the image that we're looking at. That's right. So if you think about the David, the sculpture, the David, or if you think about any kind of classical artwork that you enjoy, you will notice that it's not a direct copy of the model. Tricky stuff, isn't it? We're actually conceptualizing the information that is being handed to us. That doesn't mean that I'm not trying to record these shapes of value as accurately as I possibly can. I surely am, but I am conceptualizing by applying my understanding of structure into these values and trying to create these forms using that knowledge of structure. So in that sense, I am conceptualizing what I'm looking at. And in another sense, in the linear drawing, we did not perfectly trace out what the photograph looks like. Now, if you want to, you can trace the lines from the photograph if you want to. No shame in that. But I did not want to copy the image that I was presented with. Rather, I want to conceptualize what I'm looking at and then create works of art based on that conceptualization. So now we have a little bit more light onto the sclera. So that area of the eye, so the white of the eye known as the sclera, in general is not white. In fact, it is usually kind of a halftone, but that local value, meaning the zone of that sclera, is in general lighter than the surrounding flesh tones. Now, another little trick that I'm going to be telling you is that when you're trying to create a naturalistic or a realistic looking portrait painting, you might want to stick with a medium to fine textured canvas. Now, I've created a lot of these videos using panels, very smooth panels, sometimes rough panels, but the effect of flesh tone I have found, and I've also been told by other people, is more realistic on a canvas than it is on a very smooth panel. Now, why is that? And it's because the texture of the canvas kind of mimics the pores of our skin. What? Yes, it does mimic the pores of our skin. Notice right here, you can see the texture of the linen kind of gives you a sort of feeling of actual flesh once we add on these values. So now you're going to get a very close-up image of how I'm constructing these structures. So notice I'm kind of knitting in this value here. So this value is a little bit darker because that plane is facing the light less, but it's facing the light more than the areas further to the left. Now that's the key. You're relating each individual plane to the plane surrounding it. So this plane right here is lighter than the plane directly to the left of it, but it is darker than the plane directly to the right of it. You're relating each area to one another. That's how you're constructing these forms. And in fact, the plane right above it is darker than the plane below it, but that plane above is still lighter than, say, the hair. Tricky stuff, right? Not really. As long as you relate each shape to the corresponding shapes and think about the general placement of that shape in relation to the light source, you will be able to construct the illusion of form. Now notice that the texture of the linen canvas is now starting to mimic or starting to look more like actual flesh tones, or should I say like actual skin. Even though, of course, we're working still in a monochrome, you still get more of a sense of the underlying structure. So that is the underpainting. So we're going to let that sit overnight, and it will be dry to the touch and ready for us to apply a color pass. So now it is completely dry. Here we are pretty much a day later. So the colors that we'll be using are Zinc White, Burnt Umber, Alizarin Crimson, Cadmium Red, Yellow Ochre, Cadmium Yellow, Sap Green, Ultramarine Blue, and Ivory Black. And these colors are water mixable oil paints. That is, they clean up with water and they dry faster than traditional oil paints. Alright, so here we're going to mix up our first flesh tone. So let's start off with some Alizarin Crimson, Yellow Ochre, and the Zinc White. So let's get a nice little pink, and now let's neutralize it with the Sap Green. I tell you what, Alizarin Crimson and Sap Green are two colors that were made for each other, both in regular oil paints and in water mixable. Amazing stuff. And I will say that with the Alizarin Crimson Sap Green mixture, the reason that they neutralize the way they do is because, of course, red and green are complementary colors. So I'm very much adjusting the color. I'm trying to mix sort of a local color. So that is, I'm trying to mix up the average color that you would see when you're looking at the model. And a way to see this color more clearly is to blur your eyes when you're looking at the model. So if you're wearing glasses, so if you're nearsighted, blur your eyes by just putting your glasses down, or just kind of look from the peripheral view and then look at the model. So just blur your eyes to see this type of mixture. So I'm starting off from the forehead. So here we are a little bit higher up. So we're starting off at the top, just like we did with the underpainting. So now I see that I want my mixture to actually get a little bit warmer. So I'm sneaking in a little bit of alizarin into that mixture. And I tell you what, the consistency of the paint is now a lot thicker, not too thick. I mean, we're definitely not working with a loaded brush, but the paint consistency is much thicker now than it was for the underpainting. And so here we have another plane right about here that's a little bit more yellowish. And so having created that underpainting, so we tried to study and analyze the planes in monochrome. So that's going to give us an advantage when we come into color. So here I can see that this plane is probably a little bit more yellow in relation to the pink-ish flesh tones surrounding it. So it's a little bit more yellow in relation to the other colors. And you may notice that this brush that I'm using is a different brush than what I usually use. So it is also a watercolor brush, at least I think it is. Either that or it's an acrylic brush. But in either case, it is a synthetic brush, completely synthetic brush, and it is a round synthetic brush. And it's very helpful when it comes to getting a fine point for these mixtures. Notice that I'm patting on the color, kind of like you would be patting on some more planes onto a sculpture, very much just focused on the structure. But now we're putting some considerations for color notes into the mix. And of course, we're not going to let the colors get overly saturated either. So now with a very thin mixture of Zinc White and Ultramarine Blue, we're actually glazing the light of the sclera onto the eyes. So now with just a little less paint now, notice we're just glazing the light of the sclera right onto that area that we painted. And the reason that I'm glazing it on there is because I already like the tonal underlayer that is existing there with the underpainting. So I'm just adding onto it with a very thin application of color. And I also think that building these transparent layers of color will actually help with the illusion of flesh tones onto the finished painting. So now we have that same type of mixture that we had, just a basic flesh tone, a combination of yellow ochre, alizarin, and sap green, and we're starting to work the structures one piece at a time. So here we are just working the structure of the eye socket. So this area here is facing the light a lot less, and we're actually going to push the color change a little bit. So we're going to make it a little bit more on the violety side. And so that mixture is pretty much just ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson and a tad bit of sap green, just a touch of sap green to get that color to be not so purple, but a little bit more on the greenish side. You really want to avoid the purples. With the flesh tones, stick with the greenish tones, and violet is all right, but just stick more with the greenish or warm pinkish tones. So now this area here is going to be a little bit lighter, and you don't want to perfectly polish each shape. Now it may look like I'm doing that, but I'm actually scumbling the paint onto the surface. Again, you really want to leave some little patches of color. You don't want to make everything completely smooth, because it can look a little uncanny if everything is completely and digitally smooth. We want to leave some room for error. We want to let some of these brush strokes show. So this plane here is a little bit darker, but the subtlety is going to be created through the compression of the value range. So a lot of times people ask me, how do you get your flesh tones to be so subtle? Like, how do you paint subtlety? Well, let's think of the unforeseeable, or let's think of things that are almost imperceptible. So this shape that I'm painting in here, this little shape, this value change is so minute. It's so minuscule. It's barely perceptible. It's almost imperceptible. So let's call them the imperceptibles. And that's what this shape is. I know that the plane is a little bit darker, but I'm making that value change so small in relation to the surrounding planes that they are almost imperceptible to the eye. And that is how you create the subtlety of these planes. And we're doing this throughout all of the forms of the face. And like I said before, take breaks as often as you can, because this is a time-consuming process. But I think it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to analyze these shapes and just take it one piece at a time. And let's throw in some color variation into the mix. So let's add a little bit more of a cooler note onto this area of the side of the eye. So let's make this area a little bit cooler. So that mixture is probably just Ivory Black, Yellow Ochre, and some Zinc White. No more than that. Try and use your color variation to further describe the form. So the hue I changed to being a little bit cooler to the left of the eye, though I maintained the value the same. So there are areas where you can change the hue and leave the value alone and still create kind of a depth of field, or say a depth of form, just through the color alone. Now, it's very useful for subtlety. So to make a subtle difference, you can use a hue change, such as that change that I used, making the hue a little bit cooler. But the value alone will be the driving force, or the driving tool, to actually describe, to fully describe the depth of each form. So now we're going to be going into the side plane of the face now, just like we did with the underpainting. We're going to be starting off from the corners here that are the darkest. So the color is going to be very, very subtle, and it's going to be closer to the grayish, the warm grayish side than it is, say, the pinkish side. So as the planes angle away from the light, not only do they decrease in value, but the relative chroma will also decrease. So that is, we're taking in less chroma from the planes that are facing the light less, such as that side plane of the face that we're painting, than areas that are facing the light more. So now with a simple combination of the Sap Green and the reds, now we're going to have a little bit of a side plane here. So this is a tricky area of the structure. So it is still a side plane, but it is lighter than the cheekbone. Kind of a little tricky thing there. So imagine the values are like numbers. So let's say numbers 1 through 5 are for the side plane of the face, and then 6 through 10 are for the light plane of the face. So as long as the values 1 through 5 remain 1 through 5, we should be fine. So all that means is that we don't want any of the darks in this zone or area of the face to be as light as any of the values on the lighter side of the face. That's all that means. So now we're getting a little bit lighter as we're approaching the mouth. Notice the little band of value gets lighter and lighter as we get closer and closer to the mouth. And that's getting darker as we get closer to the jawbone. Very simple relationship there. Darker the closer you get to the jawbone, lighter the closer you get to the mouth. So here we are painting in the dark light. Now remember, the dark light is the light just before you reach the shadow side. And it's going to be the light that will help you the most in terms of the illusion of the curvature of the forms. So here we're mixing a lighter value, possibly too light. So let's add a little bit more paint onto this brush, and then add a little bit more even still. So let's add some more alizarin into the mixture. So let's see if this value is where we want it. Not quite yet. So a little bit more sap green. And so let's just reason with these values and see if we can get this plane to work out. And so now that's about the value that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and make this area a little bit softer just with the light touch of the paintbrush. So now a little bit more of the zinc white and the cadmium red, and a little bit more of the bluer tones. And let's get a little nice transition. So this is just a little band of value, just as the plane, the top plane of the zygomatic area rolls further and further towards the side plane of the face. So let's work that transition on the corner as well. So here we're painting in another little plane, and you can see very obvious that it is a very flat plane that I'm starting out with. And now I'm going to mix each individual little transition. So now we're going to put in another little transition right about here. And I will emphasize again, make sure to take breaks. Not only just to relax, but also to come back with a fresh eye. So I did take a break between painting the top area of the face before starting the values for the side plane of the face. I did take a break just to get more of a outside perspective on what the painting looks like. So now again, we're just modulating these values one brush mark at a time. So this area here, I'm going to make it darker again. So the way that this works is that the values are getting darker and darker the closer we get to the side of the face, but lighter and lighter the closer we get to the top plane of the cheekbone. Now the trick is to make sure that the forms that we are modeling, or the forms that we are rendering, are understood. So here we're painting the structures surrounding the mouth. So directly below the bottom of the mouth, it gets darker, and above it, it gets lighter. And there is a transition between the two, and that's the transition that we're painting now. So just a little bit more of the sap green and a little bit more of these pinker colors. Here we are just moving our way a little by little around the mouth. So here's this little band of value that gets darker as we approach the mouth, as it starts to curve into the mouth, and lighter as it turns away from it. That's how we're describing the form. So here, this area is a little bit lighter than, say, the side of the face, but it's still darker than, say, the forehead. So we're in a change of zones now. So we're going to be using a little bit more of the burnt umber to drop the chroma and to drop the value a little bit. So we're going to paint that right into this area right here. So let's take some more of the little halftones from the palette, maybe a little warmer, so more of the Alizarin Crimson into the mix. So this area right here is a little bit lighter, yet not as light as, say, the nose. So constantly we are comparing areas of the face to one another in terms of the values. So we're getting a little bit lighter here as we're approaching the top plane of the chin. So just a little transition of value right about here should help us out. And again, I'm using a synthetic round brush to help me delineate these forms. So here we are, the side plane of the chin, getting a little bit darker and a little bit less chromatic as we approach the bottom of the jaw. Right about here, we're going to get a dark light and a dark halftone that is going to be fairly dark. Probably the darkest area of the planes surrounding the mouth. So the planes surrounding the mouth are made up of the orbicularis oris, if you want to know the name, just like we labeled the cheekbone the zygomatic bone. The areas surrounding the mouth are known as the orbicularis oris. So here, the orbicularis oris is turning inwards towards the face and then outwards again as we approach the jaw, creating the foliage right about here that creates the shape of the chin. And as it turns closer to the light, it will be getting lighter. So right about here, it's going to be getting a little bit lighter. And so that's how we're telling the story of how the light turns around the forms. Think about this brush as a curious brush. It's the curious brush. Oftentimes I'll say we're working with a brave brush, but today we're working with a curious brush. This brush is very inquisitive. It's working its way around the structures, exploring as it goes, and comparing each and every value to one another. So now this little transitioning value needs to get a little bit darker and maybe a little bit less chromatic. So we threw in a little bit more of a neutral color for that. So now let's make things a little bit warmer with some cadmium red. Just a little bit of cadmium red, and we're going to sprinkle some red onto the top plane of the lower lip. Just a little bit more. And now we're going to use some Alizarin Crimson. It's a darker and deeper red, of course. So we're going to use that maybe with a touch of Ultramarine Blue. And now we're going to paint in the bottom plane of the lower lip, and we glazed it on there by very lightly applying the layer of paint onto the surface, still letting some of the values from the underpainting show. So now we're going to use more of the Alizarin Crimson and more of the Zinc White, and let's mix into some of the halftones there to create this transitioning value. So now we're creating more of a transitioning value from the top planes of the cheekbone as we approach the side planes and approach the side plane zone of the portrait. So this zone is going to connect the top plane of the face to the side plane of the face. So now with even more of the Alizarin Crimson and even more of the Zinc White, maybe add in a tiny bit of the Sap Green. You know, I like to mix those two together, just a tiny bit of it. And now we're going to paint in this transitioning plane. And I tell you what, I have the mixtures of color on the palette in a very strategic manner because I'm comparing the colors on the palette to one another before I'm putting the paint down onto the canvas. So that's how I kind of knit in one plane to a surrounding plane. So that plane right there for the cheekbone is going to be a little bit more rosy red. So it's going to be a little bit more pinkish. And in general, the cheeks are typically a little bit more pinkish than the surrounding colors in general, not always the case. So now we're working our way up, sculpting the forms as we go, and more the painting is starting to feel like a three-dimensional construct. rather than values. Now we're thinking of the physical structure that we are working with. Kind of a little mind game there. We're still working on a two-dimensional surface, but now it kind of feels like we're working in 3 dimensions. So now we're just moving our way up from the side plane of the structures surrounding the mouth further up. So now we added in a little bit more of a cooler mixture, a cooler and lighter mixture for the top plane of the orbicularis oris structure that is surrounding the mouth. And this area here is starting to wrap into the lighter planes of the cheekbone. So 2 zones meet one another in a transitioning area, and that transitioning area is right where the red of the cheek meets the cooler values right about here to the corner of the nose. And I left a sharper area, a sharper edge right there, closer to the nose, right about here. So I want that edge to be a little bit sharper than the surrounding edges, just to pull focus a little bit more onto the nose. And you'll notice that I leave sharper edges closer to areas of focus. And I let edges be softer in areas that are of less focus, such as the side planes of the face. Those areas are a lot softer. So now with a little bit of halftone that is a little bit more on the pinkish side, we're going to paint in this transitioning value for the side of the cheek. And it is a very simple construct. Notice how it's getting darker as it turns away from the light, lighter as it gets closer to the light. And that's all it is. It's really that simple. So now with a little bit more pink, we're going to be adding yet another plane. Now with just a little more alizarin crimson, we're going to try to punch up a little bit more warmth right about here for the cheek. And remember, the cheeks are typically a little bit more on the pinkish side. So using more alizarin crimson in that area definitely won't hurt. And now we're going to make it just a little bit cooler with a tad bit of the ultramarine blue. Tiniest bit of the ultramarine blue. And maybe a touch of sap green. So now we're going to add this high lit region right about here. So I perceive that area to be a little bit cooler than the surrounding areas, and I'm pushing it probably even cooler than it actually is with that sap green ultramarine blue mixture. So now we're going to be combining the sap green and the alizarin and the cadmium red together in a touch of ivory black to drop the value and to drop the chroma and yet still maintain a tad bit of warmth. And so this is going to give us a dark value that's not black, just a dark value that we can use for the mouth now. So right about here, a little bit of a dark value, and in the corner of the mouth, and then right about here on this corner here. And here we are back at it again. It's a brand new day. The painting is dry, and we're going to put in another sitting. So this is a wonderful thing about the water mixable oil paints and that fast drying medium. It dries overnight. Isn't that great? I mean, my paints usually take a good while to dry. And with this, I mean, it dries overnight. Now, I don't usually boast about materials too often, but I really like these water mixable oil paints. So now I just covered a flat color for the background, kind of scumbled it on, still showing some of the underpainting. So now I'm actually glazing a little bit of a halftone for where the hair meets the surrounding flesh tones. So I'm glazing onto it, kind of stylizing a little bit. So I'm going to let some of the underpainting show for the dark areas of the hair and the dark areas of the background, just to stylize a little bit. So here we are with the eyes, and now we're going to start to put the final touches onto the painting. So we're going to put in just a little, some little traces of eyelashes here. So this is a tiny brush and a combination of Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Umber, and that's going to give us some eyelashes. So just a few little brush marks on here. So that's the beauty of working on a dry painting, because if we get this wrong, just clean it off. Just as simple as that. Isn't that wonderful to be able to go in and paint these small shapes? Now, I oftentimes will say big shapes, big shapes, big shapes, but sometimes, let's face it, we want to put in some details. All right, so now with the ear, we're going to put in the earring. So we're going to start off with just a simple brush stroke of mainly just burnt umber. So now we're going in with the zinc white on top of that mixture of the burnt umber to add in the middle light of the earring. And now we're going to come back in with more zinc white and add in a little touch of highlight. Now it's not straight up zinc white. It does have a tad bit of the burnt umber in it, though it may look like straight white. It is not. And now a little bit of cadmium yellow into the mixture gives us a little more of a shimmer. Now let's paint in some of the dark shapes here for the clothing that the model is wearing. And initially I wasn't going to put this area of the painting in, but I thought, why not? Let's just go ahead and paint in these shapes. So this shape is going to be starting out with the dark. So I'm going to be kind of working in a direct painting fashion. So I'm going to lay in the darks first, and still kind of a very thin manner, and that is because this area of the painting has only seen one layer of oil, so it's still fairly thin. And I'm going to use some of the canvas to show through to give me that light area. So kind of two birds with one stone here, letting that light area show through and then putting in that surrounding red. So now we're going to put in the red of the clothing that the model is wearing, and I'm pretty much just using cadmium red with a tiny bit of burnt umber, the tiniest bit of burnt umber, just to bring down the saturation a little bit. So now we're going to town with all these little shapes. Isn't that something? So we painted in that simple shape, and now we're going to start to paint all these little designs, all these little highlights, and I don't want it to get too crazy. So we're only going to put little tiny touches here and there of shape. Little touch of green will actually help to contrast the surrounding reds. I don't really see too much green there in those highlights, but I did put a tiny bit of it into the mixture. And here we are. We put in some more information for the little fabric there. So now with yellow ochre and zinc white, we're going to just we're going to sprinkle in some little lights, some little shapes of light, right? Just a tiny bit of it here. A little tiny touch here and a little tiny touch there. We'll create the illusion of those smaller shapes. Now, with a little mixture that is very similar to the flesh tone, so very similar being it's probably just Alizarin Crimson and Sap Green, we're going to start to paint in the highlights of the hair. And with the hair, I'm really going to minimize the amount of information I'm going to put in, and I'm going to let the underpainting show through, and that is mainly because I like the way that that looks. So let's add in just a few little sprinkles here and there of light for the hair mass, a little curve here and a little curve there, and just make sure that you don't overdo it. That's the key here, especially with dark hair. You don't want to overdo those highlights. Very tiny touches. And now let's add on the final little touches to this painting. So just a few little birthmarks here to the corner with the tiniest little brush stroke. And I mean tiny, just a tiny little brush stroke to wrap up this painting. And with that, that just about wraps up this week's portrait painting demonstration. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that these videos are helping you out. I highly recommend trying out this painting technique, or if anything, I highly recommend doing that preliminary drawing. That preliminary drawing really saves you a lot of effort when it comes time to put paint onto canvas. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a wonderful week. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next video.